Today, we are going to completely dismantle that classic myth of the glamorous Roman warrior. You know, when we think of ancient Rome, we almost always picture gleaming swords, shining armor, and these glorious battlefield heroics. But we're about to reveal that Rome's true superpower wasn't its steel at all. It was actually its terrifyingly efficient supply chain.
Let's kick things off with a really profound truth from our source material. Great empires are built not on blood, but on calories. It's a super simple concept, but a totally brutal one. Hunger actually killed legionaries far more often and honestly far more effectively than enemy swords or spears ever could. To really grasp how the Roman Empire conquered the known world, we kind of have to stop looking at the battlefields and start looking at their dinner plates.
I want you to imagine a massive, moving city of 100,000 marching soldiers. That is the sheer scale we're talking about here. Try to actually picture that volume of humanity. The men, the camp followers, the horses, the beasts of burden, all of them churning up dust as they march across Europe. A moving city of this size has an absolutely insatiable appetite. And the slightest delay on the road, say a broken wheel in a narrow mountain pass or a sudden storm turning the roads to mud, that didn't just mean a temporary holdup. It meant a literal catastrophe. Without constant fuel, an entire military campaign could just inevitably collapse in a matter of days.
Now, to keep that massive army moving, it required a staggering 100 tons of grain every single day. 100 tons! That's a logistical nightmare, even by our modern standards, with our heavy freight trucks, paved highways, and high-speed rail networks. But the Romans were doing this in antiquity, across totally hostile terrain and completely unpredictable weather. This immense burden forced their commanders to spend over half their time meticulously planning bread delivery routes rather than military tactics. The greatest generals? Yeah, they were often just the greatest quartermasters.
Moving into Section 1, Rome's true secret weapon, bureaucracy and mathematics.
This brilliantly illustrates how the Romans basically invented a continuous, just-in-time supply chain a full 20 centuries before modern Japanese automotive corporations made the concept famous. It was like a massive mathematical conveyor belt. While the army was consuming its heavy supplies at the front line, thousands of peasants and mules were continuously bringing new, heavily loaded carts from the rear in a perfectly synchronized loop. The wagons rolling in met the marching army at the front, anticipating their exact daily caloric needs with absolute, ruthless precision. If the math failed, the whole army failed.
Let's look at Section 2, fueling the military machine, calories over swords.
So, the Roman military machine ran on about 1 kilogram of pure, unprocessed wheat per soldier every single day. This grain-based diet functioned exactly like modern sports carb loading. It provided stable blood sugar, slow-release energy, and just immense stamina for those insanely long marches. On the flip side, and this is super interesting, a forced meat-heavy diet actually caused widespread physical exhaustion and digestive disorders among the troops. In fact, if a Roman legion was eating only meat, they definitely didn't see it as a feast. They considered it a sign of extreme hardship and a looming logistical disaster.
But here's the thing, they didn't just hand out freshly baked loaves of bread to the troops. Every evening, the contubernarium, which was this tight-knit 8-man squad who shared a single leather tent, went through a grueling, almost CrossFit-style routine. First, they had to forage for fuel and get a campfire going. Then they had to hand-grind this rock-hard, dry grain on heavy stone mills, which is a brutally physically demanding task after you've just marched 20 miles. Finally, they cooked a thick, mortar-like porridge called pulse, or baked hard, unleavened flatbreads right in the ashes. Now, why put the soldiers through all this trouble? Because shifting the cooking and processing directly to the individual squads permanently solved the nightmare of rapid food spoilage. Dry, unprocessed grain lasts for years, while fresh flour goes bad in mere days.
And to wash down all that thick porridge, the legionaries drank something called pasca. It was essentially a mixture of dirty, natural water and cheap, sour wine. You see, dysentery and waterborne diseases were actually some of the biggest killers of ancient armies. They were fully capable of wiping out entire camps before a battle even started. So the high acidity in that sour wine reliably killed dangerous bacteria in whatever local streams or shady wells they managed to find. Sure, it might have tasted a bit like drinking harsh salad dressing, but it functioned as a highly effective, ancient antibacterial sports energy drink that kept the soldiers safely hydrated and healthy even in the sweltering heat.
All right, Section 3, the ancient transport network, moving mountains of food. So how do you actually move these literal mountains of supplies? Well, it required a very specific dual approach. On land,
Wooden carts just broke way too easily on rough paths, so they relied heavily on the stubborn mule. A single mule could carry 100 kilograms, easily cover 30 kilometers a day over totally rugged terrain, and required way less fodder than a horse. But land transport was still incredibly slow and resource-intensive, mostly because the animals ended up eating a portion of the very cargo they were carrying. So, wherever possible, the Romans turned to the rivers. Flat-bottom barges could carry massive payloads using free wind and current power, completely bypassing the muddy, broken roads. But of course, rivers had their own threats. Those barges had to be guarded around the clock by specialized river marines to protect against iron river chains and sudden pirate ambushes.
They anchored this entire vast transport network with fortress-like stone granaries. By using raised wooden floors and passive air circulation, they were actually utilizing the exact same physical principles that we find in modern industrial grain elevators today. This brilliant bit of engineering kept the wheat perfectly safe from damp rot and hungry rats for up to 2 whole years at a time. And these massive stone pantries were strategically placed all throughout the empire. An army on the move essentially just hopped from one well-stocked fortress to another, guaranteeing a secure food supply roughly every 5 days of forced marching. And I mean it when I say absolutely nothing was left to chance. The inventories were meticulously audited with wax ledgers by dedicated military clerks.
Moving to Section 4. Food in enemy territory. The brutal math of survival.
So what happens when they were forced to live off the land, way beyond their own supply lines? Well, commanders initiated something called frumentatio. And let's be clear, this was absolutely not chaotic, free-for-all looting. Not at all. It was a strictly organized, deadly, and entirely methodical military process of armed requisitioning. Half the legion would stay back to secure the fortified camp, while the other half moved out in tight, heavily armed, and highly disciplined formations to scour the foreign countryside for literally any edible resources.
The Romans would literally probe the soil with iron spears as they marched across fields, just trying to uncover hidden peasant grain caches that were buried underground. They cold-bloodedly weaponized starvation against their enemies, stripping whole regions of absolutely all resources, right down to the very last draft animal and wooden cart. The strategic logic here was devastatingly simple. A starving population cannot sustain a partisan resistance. They will surrender much faster to secure food than if you try to batter down their city walls with siege engines. And in this brutal system, absolutely all looted food was funneled strictly into the Legion's central fund. For a soldier, hiding even a small piece of stolen cheese or a handful of wheat was met with severe, immediate physical punishment.
Finally, Section 5, the mathematics of survival, when the machine breaks.
Because when logistics fail, whether that's from washed-out roads or burned-down warehouses, the degradation of a so-called invincible legion is terrifyingly rapid. It starts in mere days with reduced rations. That quickly leads to deep physical exhaustion, which causes those tightly packed marching columns to dangerously stretch out over miles, making them incredibly vulnerable to ambushes. Within weeks, the quiet whispers of complaint in the tents turn into open, armed mutiny. When the food disappears, the authority of the centurions just evaporates right along with it. To restore order in these desperate, terrifying moments, commanders were often forced to use decimation, literally executing every 10th man in the ranks. But of course, executing your own soldiers doesn't actually fill their empty stomachs, which ultimately leads to mass desertion and the total, catastrophic collapse of the fighting force.
To prevent that absolute nightmare scenario from ever happening, military clerks kept obsessive double-entry records on wax tablets. They tracked every single handful of wheat, every spare millstone, every leather tent peg that was issued to the men, and this wasn't just some administrative busywork. Bureaucracy was literally the invisible shield protecting the army from within. It allowed generals to calculate their exact survival windows down to the day and plan their grand maneuvers based purely on the cold, hard mathematics of available food, basically preventing starvation before it could even begin.
Ultimately, here is the big, profound realization I want you to take away from our explainer today. Famine destroys empires, while bread and roads make them truly eternal. Rome wasn't built on battlefield heroics alone, and its thousand-year dominance definitely wasn't secured merely by the steel swords of legendary warriors. It was built on the tireless, math-driven efficiency of ancient quartermasters in leather sandals. So the very next time you think of a mighty empire, ask yourself, who was managing their spreadsheets?